Released in 2011, Focus Entertainment's Space Marine was the pioneer for Warhammer 40k in the video game third-person scene. It was beloved by many, but unfortunately, its sequels were ultimately cancelled. But 13 years later, we're here finally with Space Marine 2, a direct follow-up to the original game for current generation consoles and PC that puts you back in the shoes of the famed Captain, now Lieutenant, Titus, bringing a load of the original mechanics up to modern times and reimagining some core aspects of the Space Marine experience while throwing in a bunch of new enemy types and factions. Does Space Marine 2 live up to the hype that it set for itself, and how was it for a fan like myself who grew up with the original Space Marine back on PS3? Well, to find out all that and more, let's take a look at Space Marine 2. As a bit of background, I am a virtual reality content creator, mostly focusing on PSVR2. PS5 is my main system, although I do have a PC, and I was playing Space Marine 2 on PS5. So if you're a regular viewer, this is a flat screen game, and if you're not a regular viewer, welcome. We do cover flat screen games like this from time to time, but again, we mostly do virtual reality here. The main thing to consider going into Space Marine 2 is that I am a massive fan of the original. Playing on PS3 and the subsequent Steam release, I put a lot of hours into the campaign, Exterminatus, and not so much the PvP modes, but I really enjoy that game for what it is. A fun hack and slash game set in the 40k universe, with decent customization, brutal kills, lots of weapons, and, well, a lot of enemies to shoot at them with. So Space Marine 2 had some massive shoes to fill, and as you jump back into the role of Titus, accompanied by 2 other squad members, you span a 7 to 9 hour campaign as you fight through waves of Xenos and heretics, and covering a mystery as you go along. That is our starting point for this video, is the story of Space Marine 2. I won't be covering anything really in depth in terms of spoilers, I'll just be talking generally about plot beats, how I found them, and overall themes and messaging of the game, and how I found it conveyed to me as a player. Starting with the main protagonist himself, Titus, I found him pretty compelling this time around. Hot off the back of the original game, 13 years ago, we're actually brought straight back up to speed with what's going on with Titus. The consequences of the original game influence him here, and that is the reason why most of the conflict happens within the Ultramarines chapter as you play through. Titus is now a Primaris Marine, and as such you're introduced to this new breed of Space Marines, since back when the original came out they didn't exist, and that gives you the player a great introduction to the new breed of Space Marine, and you're a bit of a fish out of water at points, the same as Titus, meaning that a lot of the exposition given to you feels natural and not forced. The story itself though won't blow you away completely. There are a couple twists and turns that I genuinely did not expect and were pretty damn good, but for the most part it is your general killing Xenos affair. The 2 side characters accompanying you that can be played by friends if you play in co-op, which I did for the entire campaign, have a bit more depth to them compared to the original characters from the original game. As the story progresses they'll banter in and out of gameplay, and overall I found them interesting enough to keep me engaged as they bickered and talked throughout the length of the campaign. The factions you fight against are represented quite well through the story too, meaning that the characters take them seriously, and in and out of cutscenes they stand as a proper threat. But we'll get a bit more into that in the gameplay section of this review. I did find though the lack of a compelling villain really was a weakness for the game. The only weakness in terms of the story really for me, because the original Space Marine had you facing off against the iconic war boss Grimskull, and later on a Demon Prince. Space Marine 2 does have a couple of characters that play antagonistic roles that do fill this void a little bit, but it's only in the final closing hours of the game where you really get a taste of who the antagonist of this story actually is, and the game can feel a little mindless in terms of what you're actually fighting against in terms of a big threat throughout the opening act, but that is also just a byproduct of having the Tyranids as the force you're fighting against. It's quite hard to characterize an antagonist when the main enemy faction is a nameless, faceless horde. However, this does get remedied again in the closing hours, and I did find that the eventual antagonist that gets revealed did feel threatening enough and was fun to fight. Lastly, for the story, it's represented in both gameplay and cutscenes, with dialogue occurring in both, but most of the story you'll get given through the cutscenes. These are a mix of both in-engine and pre-rendered, in-engine being much cheaper to do and being used to handle most of the cinematics, However, when things get hectic, especially towards the end of the game, where some massive, and I mean mind-blowingly massive set pieces occur, it switches to pre-rendered, because I'm assuming the Swarm engine would probably explode, trying to keyframe and animate so many things on screen at once. Each of the cutscenes feel impressive, polished, and fun to watch. It feels like I'm back playing the original game, but with a fresh, shiny, and expensive new coat of paint, which is more than I could really ask for. Overall, the story itself was serviceable, pretty good, but its presentation is the real strong suit, which was absolutely fantastic throughout. Speaking of presentation, the visuals of Space Marine 2 are out of this world, some of the best of current generation that I have ever seen. On PC, maxed out settings, it looks phenomenal, but also on PS5, in its speed or quality mode, it both looks very, very good. In 30 FPS, I think you'll get either 1440p or 4K, locked at that 30 FPS frame rate, but if you switch over to speed mode, you'll get 1080p up to 60 FPS. But in terms of fidelity, the game is almost flawless, and we'll get into that into the negative sections a little bit later, but for the most part, every glint of armor, every particle effect, every muzzle flash and las gun lighting up the battlefield looks exactly how I'd imagine a AAA incredible 40k game to look in current generation, and I could not be happier with how it's presented on screen. So many moving parts are on screen at once, especially with the use of the Swarm engine, having gargantuan groups of Tyranids rushing towards you. It's used to full effect here and is so impressive. To achieve these visuals though, there are some hits to performance which I'll expand on a little bit later, but you can expect FPS to dip down to say 40 FPS in certain massive battles in operations and campaign mode. However, we'll get a bit more in detail as to when that might happen in the negative section again. As for voice acting, Space Marine 2 puts on a pretty damn good show. Unfortunately, Mark Strong did not return as Lieutenant Titus, which is sorely missed, but the new actor is pretty damn good, capturing the essence of Titus in quite a few moments. By the end of the campaign, I was happy with him, and going forward into say Space Marine 3, I'd be happy to see him return. The actors really had a grip on the essence of Warhammer and the Space Marine chapter that they're a part of, making you believe the situations that you're in, as voice acting is a very vital component of creating a believable world, and it's done very well here. Speaking of a believable world, it's just incredible to see Warhammer recreated like this. It's something I want to touch on briefly here because it's not often we get such an accurate representation of the 40k universe, and especially towards the latter stages of the game, you get some vistas and battles that feel like the tabletop game come to life in a AAA video game. From the grandest of battles to the smallest of details on the etchings on the side of your bolter, there's care put into each and every one of the assets in Space Marine 2. And if you're a lore aficionado, a lot more than I am, you're going to get so much out of this game, especially as the game progresses and more is revealed to you throughout the story. I cannot overstate how fantastic some of the set pieces are towards the end of the game especially. It will blow your mind. The entire game can be played in co-op as well. From start to finish, the campaign, you can invite 2 of your buddies to fill in the roles of the 2 squad mates that accompany Lieutenant Titus. This is a fantastic feature to have, and I actually sat down and played through the entire campaign in one sitting with 2 of my family members, and it was an absolute blast. Playing on veteran difficulty felt pretty balanced for the most part with 3 of us, but there were certain instances, again I'll get onto in our negative section towards the end, where balancing wasn't quite on point and it felt a little bit unfair, but for the most part, your experience on the recommended veteran difficulty is going to be pretty damn good in co-op. Similarly, the operations mode has you work adjacently to the main campaign. So throughout the main campaign, you'll see other squads get assigned to different objectives while you're doing your mission as Titus, and then you can hop into the operations mode where you can choose one of 6 missions to play. And each of these missions will flash back to the campaign, and you'll take control of that other squad you saw earlier and find out what their mission was and how they achieved it. This is a really cool mechanic, and while it felt a little shoehorned in certain points when other squads were referred to and shown, at the end of it all I really understood what they were going for here, and it's a really cool feature to be able to pick up and fill in the pieces of the campaign to find out what was happening in the battles that you fought in as Titus, which makes the battles feel a lot more real and grand as other objectives are going on around you and you can see other squads fulfilling roles, and then being able to relive that later is a pretty genius feature. This is the main draw of co-op as well, as this is also 3-player co-op, and each mission randomly rolls what enemies you're going to encounter. You can replay the same mission back to back and get completely different enemy types. You can encounter a Zoanthrope, a horde of warriors, just Hormagaunts or Termagaunts, or you can encounter a bloody Carnifex. It gives a lot of replayability to the co-op operations, and the different difficulty levels add an extra layer to that. Similarly, on top of this, you also get classes and customization for your Space Marine in these co-op levels, because you're not playing as Titus, you're playing as your own Space Marines. You can customize each armor piece, choosing the actual armor itself, the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, markings, and engravings, meaning that your Space Marine can look exactly as you want it to. There are 6 classes to choose, and each are really viable and fun, especially in co-op. I personally like the Vanguard with its grapple gun, and found myself gravitating towards that most of the time. But I'm not really seeing too many people gravitate towards one or the other. It seems like a pretty even spread, so most of the classes seem a lot of fun to use. You can only have one of each class during a mission though, so each player will have to fill a different role, which I think is a good thing. Each class has different weapons, weapon upgrades, and also perk upgrades too, so there's a lot of things to progress here. The customization of both cosmetics and perks is fantastic, but there is a slight issue with customization that we'll get onto again in the negative section. Overall, the Operations is a great addition to the game, and while the replay value might get a little bit old after a couple of playthroughs of each of the missions, they've added in systems there to try and keep you coming back and playing and upgrading and earning, adjusting both the difficulty and variations of enemies during these missions. The enemies that you fight during these missions, which if you've seen any of the trailers you'll already know, but if you're going in completely blind, skip ahead by say 20 seconds, but you probably already see them in the gameplay of this video, are both Heretics and Tyranids. Each have a wide variety of enemies they throw at you, and while the Swarm engine does make for some massive mindless fights where you shoot into hordes coming at you, when you get down to it in the close quarters especially, the combat feels a lot more intentional as you have to actually choose which enemies you want to prioritize if you want to get out alive. There's a good balance between hack and slash and picking your shots, which I think is great. But the enemy variety is very vast, which is both great for the replayability side of things and also just to see so many models come to life through a video game that looks as good as this. Overall though, enemy variety again is pretty fantastic here. The melee combat is also something we need to kind of take away from the rest of this discussion and talk about on its own because it is pretty in-depth compared to the first game. The first game had you slicing your way through orcs, completing glory kills to earn back health. It's a little different in Space Marine 2 as parrying has been introduced and counters have also been introduced. So if you parry or dodge correctly on time, you'll be able to fight back with a quick shot to the head to whatever enemy attacked you. The hacking and slashing does return from the first game, but it is interjected by little moments like this, which breaks up the gameplay and makes it feel a lot less mindless. Extremis enemies, which are the most dangerous, also will sneak up on you and trigger some quick time events leading to you having to fight back or a teammate to rush over and come and help you, which is a really good addition. A bit of an interesting change though is the change to glory kills. In the first game, if you performed an execution, it would fill up your health meter and your shield would regenerate on its own. It's the opposite here in Space Marine 2. As your health doesn't regenerate on its own, your shield does, but your executions only fill up your shield. Meaning if you want to regenerate your shield, you'll have to perform those executions, and if you want to regenerate your health, you'll need to find some med stims strewn across the battlefield, or use Captain Titus's Fury ability. Each of these classes have these abilities, and a lot of them are very useful in combat, but the 3 you get in the campaign are an Orc Spec Scan, which marks enemies and increases damage dealt to them, a Fury, which blasts away and melts nearby enemies, and Titus's Fury that returns from the first game, leading to you regaining health and getting a massive boost in melee damage. Overall though, the melee combat is a little different from the first game, takes some getting used to, but once you've got the systems down, it becomes very fluid, and you get into a bit of a flow state with it, which I really enjoyed. The PvP is also present here as Eternal War returns with a couple of maps and a couple of game modes. This is perfectly fine, it's back to basics, bare bones multiplayer, with the same classes as co-op and the same weapons, meaning you can blast away at Heretics or Astartes at your will. The time to kill is fairly quick, the map designs are simple but pretty effective, and I did enjoy my time with it. However, I did find that the spawns were a little wonky, so you can get spawn trapped really quickly as the game doesn't really detect when an enemy is near your spawn. So you can spawn in, get shot, and then the game will spawn you in exactly the same place, leading you to get farmed again and again and again. This is only really a problem in Annihilation, where it's more of a team deathmatch, as the objective modes lead players to explore the map a bit more, but in Annihilation you can just sit there and farm the enemy team if you push them back far enough. Hit registration did feel pretty good though, and to be honest, it's a fun mode. Another thing I'm a little bit lukewarm on is the soundtrack. It's pretty serviceable, but after being spoilt by Jesper Kid's soundtrack for Darktide, the other Warhammer game that I put quite a lot of hours into, this one just doesn't really reach those heights, and to be honest, the highest peaks it reached was when it was calling back to the motifs that were composed in the original Space Marine. Nothing really to write home about for me, but maybe I'll have to listen to it on its own and I'll enjoy it a lot more. It is perfectly serviceable though, especially as you're slashing through enemies with the soundtrack to back you, but there was just nothing really too memorable and nothing that made me stop and listen like I do when playing Warhammer Darktide. One thing I absolutely do love though is the addition of a photo mode. Whoever's idea it was to put this in the game You are just fantastically wonderful. I spend so many hours in photo modes in games like Ghost Recon, Last of Us, you name it. If it has a photo mode, I'll be in it. And thankfully Space Marine 2 is the same. It's got fantastic features for the photo mode, many filters, pose options and emotion options, and allows you to get some fantastic quality screenshots of the game like the one used for the thumbnail of today's video. If you like photo modes, Space Marine 2 has you covered, which I could not be happier about. Okay, now that I've gushed over the game for the last 20 minutes or so, and will gush over it again after we're done with this section, let's talk about some of the issues that I run into. Starting from the beginning in the order that I mentioned them throughout the other sections of the video, let's talk about the visual issues. Now these are few and far between, but occasionally the game spawns in a load of enemies and weird green lines start appearing from their spawn point. This appeared both on PC and on PlayStation and on Xbox, and it's just a little bit jarring when it happens. However, that's quite a small issue. It only happens a couple times in the game and it's barely noticeable at all. A small issue for me as well was, again, the voice acting. I can't really fault the performance of the new Titus voice actor, but the loss of Mark Strong is very, very felt. However, again, that is very, very small and just a nitpick for me, and by the end of the campaign I was fairly used to him, but yeah, nothing really to be done about that one. Something can be done about the performance though. As mentioned, the performance dips down into the 40s or 50s in terms of FPS during larger scenes, and even slows down to a crawl and almost crash my console on one particular time. These performance issues plague both console and PC, but it's not really horrendous. You can get through these combat encounters and still react in time, and the game still feels good to play, but you can really feel those dips in certain instances when a lot is happening on screen, especially towards the end of the game. And while I did really enjoy it, I'd love to see these tightened up and some performance improvements made as the game goes on. The game balancing issues that I mentioned are mostly prevalent in the defending sections of the game. In certain sections of the game, you'll be tasked with defending certain areas, and in solo, your AI companions, most of the time, will just completely ignore these areas and leave the Tyranids to tear them to pieces, leaving it up to you to try and stop them, which is not the fairest. However, the worst defender for these defending sections comes with a segment where you have to defend an elevator that you're on and stop the Tyranids from destroying the chains that are holding you up. This is just not a very well constructed segment, unfortunately, and it's really the only part of the game where I can say that. The rest of the game feels really playtested and polished in terms of enemy placement, and is fair but hard, when playing on veteran difficulty at least. However, here enemies are spawned and then not thrown into the arena, meaning that you'll get some ranged Tyranids that can essentially lock onto you from any range, that sit behind walls and can basically shoot through them. So as we were stuck on this section for about an hour, it took quite a while to figure out where the spawns were coming from and how to get around them, because these Tyranids were jumping up to an area where you couldn't see them from the main platform and shooting you through walls, meaning you'll get shot at and not know where it's from, leading to a really frustrating experience. We did eventually clear this section after a couple tries, but it just didn't feel like it had been playtested well enough and indicated well enough where the enemies were actually coming from. And small things like that can just ruin the experience just that little bit from time to time, but again they are few and far between, but that section was properly painful. I'd love to see some pathing improvements for the Tyranids in that, because they get stuck and then shoot you from impossible angles. Finally, the biggest issue that we've run into is customization, actually. If you are spending your currency on customization, and you're on console especially, do not redeem any of the DLC cosmetics for currency, because there's a decent chance you'll log back on and it'll be gone. Not reset and not given your currency back, I mean it'll be gone and your currency will not be refunded, meaning you'll spend, up to 300 of the game's credits, which is a fair amount. For perspective, that would take 10 full easy missions to get back. You can spend it all on a nice helmet and a color scheme from the DLC section of the heraldry chart, and log back in and it'll be gone, along with your currency, meaning that, especially if you bought the Ultra Edition and got currency with your purchase, that is now wasted and gone, which is really, really annoying. Focus needs to compensate people who've lost cosmetics to this, and I'm not even one of them. It's one of the people that I'm playing with that has lost their cosmetics and their currency completely twice now. It's only on the DLC cosmetics that we found it happens, but it's really frustrating, and Focus kind of need to compensate either with giving out some credits to players as a whole and just giving them to everybody if they can't identify who's lost what, or opening up a line of communication to tell them your account details and then compensating you fairly. That's a really frustrating thing that has been brought up a couple of times in forums and unfortunately been downvoted in a lot of the instances that I've seen, but it is a real thing and it has happened to some players I played with. Anyway, those are the only negatives of the game that I found. Apart from that, Space Marine 2 is an absolute triumph of a Warhammer 40k game that I absolutely love from start to finish. It's everything that I dreamed the sequel would be, and it's just surreal that we're here, and after 13 years, it finally exists. With the ending to the game, I'd love to see where this franchise goes next. I'm all aboard, and I'd love for Focus to keep on going. It seems like it's been a critical and commercial success, so that bodes well for the future. Space Marine 2 takes the most impossibly gigantic battles from the Warhammer 40k universe and puts them into a visual medium like never before. This is the best way to experience what Warhammer has to offer if you're a fan of TV, games and film. It's a perfect introduction to the franchise if you've never played before, and if you're a fan, it's even more enriching. Anyway, have you played the game? What do you think of it? Are you waiting for normal release? Are you waiting for a sale? Do you not know what Warhammer even is? Either way, I hope you did enjoy. Thank you all for watching. Thank you to our patrons and YouTube members: Luke Bentley, Phil Irving, Hazit Mirza, Ace Gamer, Hippie Pickle, Jin007, A License to Chill, Sun WTF, Fat Controllers, Jason Parker, Lamar Hall, Geordie Bansma, Lemon64K, Callum Tierney, Mischievous Marco, The Underground Gamecat, Brian East, Alajimbe D2Y, Underground Stranger Gamecat, The Gamecat, Andrew Ehrenreich, Mark Smith, XKX Ping, Jazzafash, The Legacy of Canecat, Hooked Worm, The Hoosier Gamecat, Outcast VR, Prophecy777, Test Rate Review, Salvador Wade, Evangelos Kieran, Sean Krim, and Gundy Gundy. If you want to join that list of names, please take a look in the description below. But thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.